Ever wondered why your refrigerator only has cow's milk, or maybe almond or oat milk, but never dog's milk, or cat's milk, or even human milk from a lactating woman? Even though technically every mammal on this planet produces milk for its babies. And that single question opens up one of the strangest and most fascinating stories in human history. A story that mixes biology, economics, culture, and even a bit of squeamishness. By the end of this, you will never look at your morning glass of milk the same way again. So let's start with the obvious myth first, because contrary to what the title of this video might suggest, humans do not exclusively drink cow's milk. In fact, across the globe, people drink milk from goats, sheep, buffalo, camels, yaks, reindeer, and even horses. So the real question is not why do we never drink other animals' milk, but rather, why do we only drink milk from a very small, very specific list of animals, and why does that list almost never include animals like dogs, cats, pigs, bears, or whales? And once you frame it that way, the answer becomes a lot more interesting, because it turns out the list of milkable animals was decided thousands of years ago. Not by nutritionists or scientists, but by early farmers who were essentially running a giant accidental experiment in domestication. And the animals that made the cut had to check several boxes at once. They had to be herd animals that tolerate humans being close to their babies. They had to produce way more milk than their own offspring needed. They had to be calm enough to be milked twice a day without kicking a farmer across the barn. And they had to reproduce on a predictable cycle, so farmers could keep the milk supply going year-round. And when you look at cows, goats, sheep, buffalo, and camels, they all check these boxes almost perfectly. Cows, in particular, are a milk-producing miracle, because a wild ancestor cow's calf might need around 3 to 4 liters of milk a day, but a modern dairy cow can produce over 25 liters a day, which means there is a massive surplus just sitting there, ready for humans to take. And that surplus is really the entire secret, because milk production is fundamentally about economics. If an animal doesn't produce a large surplus beyond what its baby needs, milking it is a waste of time and calories for the farmer. And this is exactly why you will never see rabbit milk or mouse milk or hamster milk in a grocery store, because a mother rabbit might produce only around 30 to 50 milliliters of milk a day, which is barely a spoonful, and you would need dozens of rabbits milked constantly just to get a single glass, and that math simply doesn't work for a species that needs food efficiently. Now let's talk about the animals that are biologically possible to milk, but that humans have almost universally avoided. And dogs and cats sit right at the top of that list, because technically, dog milk and cat milk are perfectly drinkable and even nutritious. But here's the catch. Dog milk is actually higher in protein and fat than cow's milk. But here's the catch. Dogs and cats are not herd animals. They don't produce a large surplus of milk. A mother dog usually makes only enough for her own puppies with very little extra, and physically restraining a female dog or cat to milk her twice a day is both dangerous and impractical. Not to mention the fact that in most cultures, dogs and cats became companions and working partners rather than livestock. So there was a strong cultural and emotional barrier layered on top of the biological one. And that emotional barrier is actually a huge underrated part of this whole story, because milk consumption isn't just about calories, it's about what a culture is willing to psychologically accept. And this brings us to, arguably, the most fascinating case study of all, human milk itself. Because think about it, human breast milk is scientifically one of the most perfectly balanced foods on the planet for human bodies specifically. Yet, almost no adult human on Earth drinks human milk as a regular dietary choice. And this isn't because it's unsafe in small amounts, it's almost entirely a cultural and psychological taboo. The idea of an adult drinking milk pumped from another adult human feels deeply uncomfortable to most people, even though biologically it makes more sense for a human to drink human milk than to drink milk from a completely different species like a cow. And this tells us something profound, that our food choices are not purely rational or purely nutritional. They are shaped by thousands of years of cultural conditioning, taboos, and what feels normal within a society. Now let's talk about the animals where milking is simply too dangerous or too impractical to ever become mainstream. And lions, bears, and other large predators are the perfect example here. Because yes, a lioness produces milk, but walking up to a lioness twice a day with a bucket is essentially a death wish. These animals are not domesticated, they are not herd animals used to human proximity, and their maternal instincts around their cubs are intensely protective. So even though the milk exists, the risk completely outweighs any nutritional benefit. And then there's an entirely different category of animals, where the milk itself is biologically bizarre and almost impossible to consume the way we drink cow's cow's milk. And whale and dolphin milk is the wildest example of this. Because whale milk is not liquid the way we imagine milk to be, it's incredibly thick, almost like toothpaste or pudding, with a fat content that can reach up to 50% compared to cow's milk, which is usually only around 3 to 4% fat. This extreme thickness exists because whale milk needs to be nutrient dense enough to help a calf build blubber quickly in freezing ocean water. But that also means whale milk doesn't mix with water the way regular milk does, since it needs to stay intact underwater without instantly dissolving. So even in the completely hypothetical scenario where humans could safely milk a whale, what you'd end up with is basically a barely edible block of fat, not a refreshing glass of milk. And pig milk is another interesting case, because pigs are absolutely domesticated and raised for food in massive numbers worldwide, so on paper they should be perfect for dairy too. But pig anatomy creates a strange obstacle. A mother pig, or sow, releases milk in short, synchronized bursts that only last about 10 to 20 seconds at a time, spaced out over roughly an hour. And outside of those tiny windows, physically getting milk out of her is extremely difficult, which makes automated or manual milking on any large commercial scale nearly impossible. So despite pigs being farmed everywhere, pig milk never became commercially viable. And this pattern keeps repeating throughout this story. Biology sets the boundaries of what's possible, but human convenience, safety, and cultural comfort decide what actually ends up in the fridge. And now here's where it gets even more interesting, because different regions of the world absolutely did make different choices depending on what animals were available and useful in their environment. In South Asia and the Middle East, buffalo milk became incredibly popular because it has a much higher fat content than cow's milk, making it ideal for producing rich dairy products like ghee and certain cheeses. In mountainous regions of Central Asia, yak milk became essential because yaks can survive in freezing, high-altitude conditions where cows simply cannot. In desert regions of the Middle East and North Africa, camel milk became a lifeline because camels can survive extreme heat and drought while still producing nutritious milk. And camel milk is actually naturally lower in fat and closer to human milk in some nutritional aspects than cow's milk is. And in Scandinavian and Arctic regions, reindeer milk historically played a role for the same reason. It came from the animal that could actually survive and thrive in that harsh climate. So the list of milkable animals was never random. It was a direct reflection of which animals a specific region could realistically raise, protect, and milk safely and efficiently. And once cow's milk became dominant globally through colonization, industrialization, and modern dairy farming, it essentially became the default in most Western countries, which is exactly why someone growing up in the United States might assume cow's milk is just normal milk, while someone growing up in Mongolia might grow up drinking horse milk, and someone in parts of India might grow up drinking buffalo milk as the primary household milk. And none of these are more correct than the others. They're just different answers to the same evolutionary and economic question. And if you zoom out and look at the big picture, the real answer to why do we never drink other animals' milk isn't really about biology being impossible. It's about a very specific combination of factors all lining up at once. The animal needs to produce a large surplus of milk. It needs to be safe and calm enough to milk repeatedly. It needs to reproduce predictably. Its milk needs to actually be liquid and practical to consume. And on top of all of that, the culture around it needs to psychologically accept the idea. And when you filter every mammal on Earth through all of those requirements simultaneously, you end up with an incredibly short list: cows, goats, sheep, buffalo, camels, yaks, and a handful of others. And that's not a coincidence. That's the result of roughly 10,000 years of trial and error by early farmers who were essentially running the world's longest agricultural experiment without even realizing it. So the next time you pour milk into your coffee or cereal, remember, you're not just drinking a random liquid. You're drinking the end result of thousands of years of human history, animal biology, and cultural evolution, all combined into a single glass. And honestly, once you know the real story, it makes that ordinary carton of milk in your fridge feel a whole lot less ordinary.